November 22, 1945. Camp Swift, Texas. The air hung cold and sharp. 3 German women stepped off a military transport truck, their breath visible in white puffs, their eyes scanning for the brutality they'd been promised would come. Greta, Anna, and Liesel, ages 19, 21, and 18, had spent months in Allied camps, bracing for the American cruelty that Nazi propaganda had burned into their minds for years. They expected torture chambers, starvation, revenge. Instead, Captain Mitchell greeted them with words that made no sense. "Welcome to Texas, ladies. You didn't start this war, and neither did I. Clean barracks, warm beds, the same food as American soldiers." But it was Thanksgiving Day when everything they believed shattered completely. The Americans said something impossible, something that broke every rule of war they knew. "You're invited too. It's Thanksgiving." At that table, surrounded by enemy soldiers serving them turkey and kindness, these hardened prisoners of war did something no Nazi training had prepared them for. They wept. If you want to hear more incredible untold stories from history, hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments what city you're watching from. It's amazing to see how far these stories of unexpected humanity can travel. The truck lurched to a stop with a grinding screech of brakes, sending the 3 women sliding against each other on the hard wooden bench. Through the canvas flaps, Greta caught her first glimpse of Texas. Endless sky the color of old pewter, stretching wider than anything she'd ever seen in Dresden. The November air bit sharp and clean when the tailgate dropped, so different from the smoke-choked atmosphere of the bombed cities they'd left behind. "Out you go, ladies," said the American driver, his voice neither harsh nor kind, just tired. He couldn't have been much older than Anna, with the same hollow look they all wore now, the expression of people who'd seen too much and slept too little. Greta was the first to climb down, her legs unsteady after hours of travel. The ground felt solid beneath her worn boots, a small mercy after months of uncertainty. Anna followed with military precision, her back straight despite exhaustion, that Wehrmacht auxiliary badge still pinned stubbornly to her faded uniform jacket. Liesel came last, clutching a small canvas bag that held everything she owned in the world. 3 changes of clothes and a stub of pencil she'd been saving to write letters that might never reach home. Camp Swift stretched before them like a small city of temporary buildings, all sharp angles and utilitarian brown. Guard towers rose at intervals, manned but somehow not menacing. American soldiers moved between the structures with an efficiency Greta recognized from her own military service, but there was something different here. They laughed occasionally, called out casual greetings to each other. In her experience, soldiers only relaxed when they felt safe. "This way," said their escort, a young sergeant with kind eyes who'd introduced himself simply as Patterson. He'd offered them water during the journey and hadn't flinched when Anna refused to answer his questions in anything but clipped German. Now he led them past rows of identical barracks, past groups of men in faded Wehrmacht uniforms who looked up with curious, hollow faces as the 3 women passed. The building that would house them sat slightly apart from the others, surrounded by a small yard where laundry lines hung empty in the cold air. Patterson pushed open the door and gestured them inside, and Greta felt her breath catch. Clean wooden floors, 4 real beds with actual mattresses and folded blankets, a small wood stove that radiated blessed warmth, 2 windows with glass that wasn't cracked or boarded over. "Hot water's down the hall," Patterson said, switching to careful German that made Anna's eyebrows lift in surprise. "Mess hall serves at 0600, 1200, and 1800. Same food as our boys get." He paused, studying their stunned faces. "Captain Mitchell will want to meet you tomorrow, but tonight you rest. You're safe here." After he left, the 3 women stood in silence, afraid to believe what they were seeing. Liesel reached out tentatively to touch one of the blankets, wool, thick and soft. Anna moved to the window and stared out at the camp, her jaw tight with suspicion. Greta sank onto the nearest bed and felt the mattress give beneath her weight, a luxury she'd almost forgotten existed. "It's a trick," Anna said finally, her voice flat. "They're softening us up for interrogation, making us grateful so we'll talk." Talk about what? Liesel asked, her voice barely above a whisper. What secrets do we have? I was just a radio operator. You shot at planes that were too high to hit anyway. Greta sent messages about supply shortages and weather reports. It doesn't matter what we know, Anna replied, but there was something uncertain in her tone now. Americans hate us. Everyone knows that. They're probably planning to work us to death in their factories, or worse. Greta stood and moved to the stove, holding her hands out to catch the warmth. For the first time in months, she felt the tight knot of fear in her stomach begin to loosen just slightly. Then why give us beds? Why heat? Why not just throw us in a hole somewhere? The question hung in the air unanswered. Outside, they could hear voices, American soldiers calling to each other, the sound of a truck engine starting, someone laughing at a joke they couldn't understand. Normal sounds, human sounds, not the sounds of a place where torture and murder happened. That night, after a dinner of real bread and soup that actually had meat in it, Greta lay on her bed and stared at the ceiling. Through the thin walls, she could hear Liesel's soft breathing, already settled into sleep. Anna remained rigidly awake on the bed nearest the door, still wearing her jacket, still ready to fight or run. Anna, Greta whispered into the darkness. What? What if they really mean it? What if they just want to treat us like human beings? The silence stretched so long that Greta thought Anna wouldn't answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was thick with something that might have been grief. Then everything we were taught was a lie. Everything our fathers died believing was a lie. Everything we did in service to the fatherland was for nothing. Maybe, Greta said softly. Or maybe the lie was thinking that enemies can't choose to be merciful. Anna's response was so quiet that Greta almost missed it. I don't know how to live in a world where enemies show mercy. Neither do I, Greta admitted. But we're here and we're alive, and tomorrow we'll find out what American mercy actually looks like. Outside, a guard walked past their window, his footsteps crunching on frozen ground. Inside, 3 German women who'd been taught to hate and fear Americans closed their eyes and slept more peacefully than they had in years, wrapped in enemy blankets, warmed by enemy fuel, fed by enemy food, and somehow, impossibly, beginning to hope that survival might mean more than just staying alive. The mess hall buzzer cut through the morning air at exactly 6 o'clock. And Greta woke to find Anna already dressed and standing by the window, watching American soldiers emerge from their barracks like ants from disturbed hills. Liesel sat on the edge of her bed, sketching something in the margin of a piece of paper she'd found, probably another of her portraits capturing some fleeting expression that spoke to her artist's eye. They're very organized, Anna observed, her voice carrying the grudging respect one soldier gives another. Look how they form up without shouting, without chaos. Even their prisoners maintain better discipline than most units I served with. Greta pulled on her jacket and smoothed her hair as best she could without a proper mirror. Maybe that's because they're not afraid of being shot for small mistakes. The walk to the mess hall revealed more of Camp Swift in daylight, neat rows of buildings connected by well-maintained paths, gardens where someone had been growing winter vegetables until recently, bulletin boards covered with notices in multiple languages. German prisoners moved freely between areas, working alongside American guards who chatted with them in broken German or enthusiastic hand gestures. Inside the mess hall, the smell hit them first. Real coffee, bacon, eggs cooked in actual butter. Greta's stomach clenched with hunger so sharp it made her dizzy. They'd eaten better here in one night than they had in months back home, where rations had dwindled to turnips and ersatz bread that tasted like sawdust. "Get in line anywhere," called an American cook, a heavy-set man with flour on his apron who gestured toward the serving area. "Same food for everybody." Anna hesitated, clearly expecting some trick, but hunger won over suspicion. They took metal trays and moved through the line where American soldiers served them portions that would have fed a family for 2 days in wartime Berlin. Scrambled eggs, real bacon, toast made from actual wheat, coffee that steamed black and rich in their cups. "Over here, girls," called a voice, and they turned to see a tall black woman in an American uniform gesturing to an empty table near the windows. She moved with the confident bearing of someone accustomed to command, her uniform pressed and proper, her smile genuine but measured. "Sergeant Mary Washington," she introduced herself in careful German as they approached. "I supervise the kitchen and laundry details. You'll be working with me." Anna's posture stiffened. In Germany, she'd never worked alongside black people. Nazi propaganda had taught her they were inferior, dangerous, barely human. But here was this woman in an American uniform, clearly in a position of authority, speaking German and offering them seats at her table. "You speak German very well," Greta said, settling into her chair and trying not to stare at the abundance of food on her plate. "My grandmother was German," Mary replied, switching to English. "From Hamburg. She taught me the language along with how to make proper strudel, though I doubt you'll find that in the Army cookbook." Liesel laughed, the first genuine laugh Greta had heard from her since before the bombing of their transport convoy months ago. "My mother made strudel every Sunday before the war. The whole house would smell like apples and cinnamon." "Mine too," Mary said softly. "Some things cross all borders, don't they? Grandmother's strudel, the smell of home." They ate in comfortable silence for several minutes, the three German women still uncertain how much conversation was safe or appropriate. Around them, the mess hall buzzed with the multilingual chatter of men who'd found ways to communicate across language barriers, pointing at food, laughing at shared jokes, playing card games with rules that seemed to change every few minutes. "What kind of work will we be doing?" Anna asked finally, her soldier's mind already cataloging duties and responsibilities. "Kitchen prep in the mornings, laundry in the afternoons," Mary replied. "Same work I do, same hours. You'll earn credit toward personal supplies, soap, paper, stamps for letters home. The Red Cross coordinator comes by every Tuesday if you need help contacting family." The mention of family hit like cold water. Greta set down her fork, appetite suddenly gone. "The Red Cross, do they have information about what happened to German cities? About survivors?" Mary's expression grew gentle. "They try to track displaced persons, reunite families when possible. It's slow work, but they don't give up easily." She paused, studying Greta's face. "Someone specific you're looking for?" "My sister. She was 14 when I left Dresden for military service. I don't know if she—" Greta couldn't finish the sentence. The bombing of Dresden had been mentioned in whispers at their previous camps, always with shaking heads and changed subjects. "We'll ask them to check their lists," Mary said firmly. "Hope is not something you surrender until you have absolute proof it's gone." After breakfast, Mary led them to the kitchen complex, where American soldiers were already deep into food preparation for the day. The space was larger and better equipped than any kitchen Greta had ever seen. Industrial stoves, huge mixing bowls, refrigeration units that actually worked. Three American cooks looked up as they entered, nodded politely, and went back to their work without staring or commenting. "Frank, Joe, Pete," Mary said, pointing to each in turn. "This is Greta, Anna, and Liesel. They'll be helping with prep work." The men acknowledged the introductions with waves and smiles as if having enemy prisoners join their kitchen staff was the most natural thing in the world. Pete, a young man with a thick Boston accent, immediately put Liesel to work peeling potatoes and started teaching her English words for kitchen equipment. Frank showed Anna how to operate the industrial bread slicer, speaking slowly and clearly, repeating instructions without impatience when she asked him to explain again. Joe, the eldest, set Greta to washing dishes and told her stories about his own grandmother who'd immigrated from Bavaria in the previous century. By midday, Greta realized something remarkable was happening. They were working alongside their former enemies as if they were simply people who happened to need jobs done. No one watched them suspiciously or treated them as dangerous prisoners. When Liesel dropped a pot and it clattered loudly across the floor, the Americans laughed along with her embarrassment instead of shouting or threatening punishment. "This isn't what I expected," Anna murmured to Greta during their lunch break, her voice confused and almost angry. "What did you expect?" Greta asked. "I expected to hate them," Anna replied quietly. "I expected them to make it easy by being the monsters we were told they were. Instead, they're just people. People who happen to speak English and eat different food and tell jokes I don't understand yet." She paused, watching Pete help Liesel learn the English names for different vegetables. How do you hate someone who teaches your friend new words just because she wants to learn them? Greta had no answer. She was beginning to suspect that hatred required distance, required seeing people as symbols rather than individuals. It was much harder to hate someone who shared their coffee and asked about your family and worked beside you with patient, steady kindness. The announcement came on a crisp Tuesday morning while they were peeling turnips in the kitchen. Captain Mitchell appeared in the doorway, his uniform pressed, but his manner relaxed, the way a man looks when he's about to share good news. The kitchen fell quiet as all eyes turned toward him, American soldiers and German prisoners alike pausing in their work. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying easily across the room, "Thanksgiving is this Thursday, and I want to extend an invitation to everyone here, Americans, Germans, all of you, to join us for a special dinner." He looked directly at the three women, his eyes kind but serious. "That means you too, Greta, Anna, Liesel. You're invited to share our table." The silence that followed stretched like a held breath. Greta felt her heart skip against her ribs. In all her years of military service, through all the propaganda lectures and ideological training, no one had ever suggested that enemies might sit down together for a meal. Wars had rules, and those rules didn't include dinner invitations. "Sir," Anna said carefully, her English still halting but determined, "we are prisoners, German prisoners." Captain Mitchell nodded thoughtfully. "Yes, you are. You're also young women far from home during a holiday that's about gratitude and Thanksgiving. Seems to me that applies to everyone, regardless of which uniform they wore last year." After he left, the kitchen erupted in excited chatter. Frank immediately began explaining Thanksgiving traditions to anyone who would listen. The turkey, the stuffing, the cranberry sauce that nobody really liked but everyone ate anyway. Pete started teaching Liesel the English words for various holiday foods, drawing pictures on a scrap of paper to illustrate wishbone and gravy. But Anna stood frozen at her workstation, her hands clenched around the paring knife. "It's psychological warfare," she said finally, her voice tight with the old certainty. "They want to make us grateful, make us forget who we are, where we came from, make us betray everything our fathers died defending." "What if it's not?" Greta asked quietly. "What if they just want to be kind?" "Kindness is a luxury for people who weren't raised to understand the world properly," Anna replied. But there was something hollow in her voice now, as if she were reciting lines from a play she no longer believed in. Mary Washington, who'd been listening from across the room, approached them with the measured gait of someone who'd navigated difficult conversations before. "Mind if I share something with you girls?" Anna's jaw tightened, but she nodded curtly. "Last year I spent Thanksgiving alone in a segregated mess hall in Alabama," Mary said, her voice matter-of-fact but not bitter. "White soldiers ate turkey and stuffing in the main dining room while colored soldiers got leftovers served in the basement. Same army, same war, different tables." She paused, letting that sink in. "This year, Captain Mitchell specifically requested that everyone, and I mean everyone, eat together. German prisoners, black soldiers, white officers. Same table, same food, same respect." "Why are you telling us this?" Anna asked, though her hostility had shifted to something more like confusion. "Because sometimes an invitation is just an invitation," Mary replied, "and sometimes it's a chance for people to be better than the world expects them to be. Your choice which one you want to believe." That evening, the three women sat on their beds and argued in fierce whispers that carried all the weight of their fractured world. Anna paced the small space between the bunks, her Wehrmacht badge catching the light from the single bulb overhead. "They're trying to break us down psychologically," she insisted. "Make us forget our loyalty, our duty to the fatherland. My father died believing that Germans were superior, that we were fighting for something noble and right. If I sit at their table, if I eat their food and smile at their jokes, what does that make his sacrifice?" Liesel looked up from the portrait she'd been sketching, Captain Mitchell's face, captured with surprising skill on a piece of brown paper. "Maybe it makes his sacrifice mean that his daughter survived to have a choice about kindness." "You don't understand," Anna said, but her voice cracked slightly. You're both too young to remember Germany before the war, when we had pride, when we had purpose. These Americans, they want to strip all that away and leave us as grateful little pets who wag our tails for scraps from their table. Greta had been quiet through most of the argument, but now she stood and moved to the window. Outside, American soldiers were stringing lights between buildings, preparing decorations for their holiday. Their laughter drifted through the glass, mixing with music from someone's radio, a jazz tune that would have been banned as degenerate back home. I keep thinking about Dresden, Greta said finally, about the night before I left for military service. My grandmother made sauerbraten even though meat was rationed because she said some occasions were worth sacrifice. She told me that sharing a meal was how people proved they trusted each other, how they proved they saw each other as human. That was different, Anna protested. That was family. These are enemies. Are they? Greta turned from the window. Pete spent 20 minutes yesterday teaching Liesel how to say beautiful drawing in English because he wanted to compliment her sketches. Frank gave me his own coffee ration when he noticed I looked tired. Mary told us stories about her grandmother's strudel recipe and asked about our families like she actually cares about the answers. It's all manipulation, Anna said, but the words came out like a question now rather than a statement. Maybe, Greta conceded, or maybe they're just people who've decided that the war is over and they want to act like human beings again. Maybe they're as tired of hating as we are of being hated. Liesel set down her sketching and looked at both her friends with those gentle eyes that seemed to see more than they should. I think I want to go, she said softly. I want to see what it feels like to be invited somewhere instead of just ordered or assigned or processed. I want to remember what it's like to be treated like a guest instead of a problem to be solved. Anna stared at her, and for a moment her rigid posture crumbled slightly. If we go, if we sit at their table and eat their food, everything changes. We can't go back to believing what we believed before. We can't pretend they're monsters anymore. Maybe that's the point, Greta said gently. Maybe monsters were always just people who forgot how to see each other as human. Maybe the choice isn't whether to trust them. Maybe the choice is whether we want to keep being the kind of people who can only survive by hating everyone around us. The room fell quiet except for the distant sound of American voices raised in some cheerful argument about football scores. 3 German women sat in the pause between their old world and whatever came next, each knowing that tomorrow's answer would change them in ways they couldn't yet understand. Thursday morning arrived gray and cold, with a kind of Texas wind that cut through fabric and found every gap in a person's defenses. Greta woke before the buzzer, her stomach twisted with nerves that had nothing to do with hunger. Across the room, Anna sat on the edge of her bed, fully dressed, but staring at her hands as if they held answers she couldn't quite read. Liesel hummed softly while braiding her hair, one of those German lullabies their mothers had sung, back when mothers and lullabies still existed in their world. They'd decided the night before, after hours of whispered debate, that they would attend. Not because they trusted American motives, but because the alternative, sitting alone in their barracks while the sounds of celebration drifted through the walls, felt like a different kind of surrender. The mess hall had been transformed overnight. Long tables covered with white sheets stretched across the room, decorated with pine boughs and candles that cast warm light against the institutional walls. The smell that greeted them was overwhelming. Turkey roasting, bread baking, spices that reminded Greta of Christmas mornings before the world fell apart. American soldiers moved between the tables, setting out dishes and chattering with excitement that seemed genuine rather than performed. "Over here, ladies," called Sergeant Washington, gesturing toward a table near the center of the room where several American soldiers were already seated. No segregated corner, no separate serving area, they were being placed in the heart of the celebration, as visible as anyone else. Captain Mitchell approached as they hesitated near the entrance, their courage suddenly feeling fragile in the face of so much unfamiliar warmth. "I'm glad you decided to join us," he said, and something in his voice made it clear he truly meant it. "Come, let me introduce you to some folks." The introductions blurred together. Corporal Johnson from Ohio, Private Martinez from New Mexico, Sergeant Thompson, who'd grown up on a farm in Iowa and kept asking Liesel about her sketches. Each man stood when they were introduced, a courtesy that made Anna's eyes widen with confusion. In her experience, soldiers didn't stand for prisoners, especially not enemy prisoners, especially not female enemy prisoners. "You sit anywhere you like," said a cheerful voice, and they turned to see an older civilian woman arranging rolls on a nearby table. "I'm Mrs. Henderson from Austin. My church group brought some extra dishes because we figured you boys could use a proper feast for once." "You came from town to cook for us?" Greta asked, switching to careful English. "Honey, it's Thanksgiving," Mrs. Henderson replied, as if that explained everything. "Nobody should spend Thanksgiving alone, especially not young folks so far from home. You girls must be missing your families something fierce." The simple acknowledgement hit harder than any interrogation could have. Greta felt her throat tighten, and beside her, Liesel's eyes filled with tears. She tried to blink away. Anna stood rigid, her face a mask of control, but her hands trembled slightly at her sides. When Captain Mitchell called for everyone to take their seats, the three women found themselves surrounded by Americans who made room for them as naturally as if they'd always belonged there. Corporal Johnson helped Liesel with her chair. Private Martinez passed them napkins and made sure their water glasses were full. Sergeant Thompson pointed out each dish as it was served, explaining in simple English what they were eating. "This here's stuffing, bread mixed with sage and onions, and that's cranberry sauce, though it's an acquired taste. Green bean casserole, my mother's recipe, or close as the Army cooks can manage. Sweet potatoes with marshmallows, which I know sounds strange, but trust me on it." The abundance was staggering. Greta had forgotten that food could be anything other than fuel for survival. Here was a feast that celebrated flavor, comfort, tradition, the kind of meal that said, "We have enough. We can afford to be generous. We choose to share what we have rather than hoard it." When the Methodist minister from Austin stood to say grace, the room fell silent. Greta tensed, expecting prayers for American victory or German defeat, but instead the man's words were simple and inclusive. "We give thanks for this food, for the hands that prepared it, and for the opportunity to share it with friends, both old and new. We're grateful for bringing these young women safely to our shores, and we pray for wisdom and compassion as we all try to find our way forward in peace." The phrase struck Greta like a physical blow. Bringing these young women safely to our shores. Not captured enemies or dangerous prisoners, but people who'd been brought to safety. The distinction felt revolutionary. As plates were passed and conversation started, Anna sat frozen in her chair, her food untouched, her eyes wide with something approaching panic. The kindness was overwhelming her defenses faster than she could rebuild them, and Greta watched her friend's carefully constructed worldview crumbling in real time. "You okay, miss?" asked Corporal Johnson, his concern genuine. "Food not to your liking?" Anna looked at him, really looked, and saw a young man barely older than herself, someone who might have been her brother or her neighbor in another life. He wasn't a faceless American monster from propaganda posters. He was just a person, worried about whether she had enough to eat, whether she felt welcome at his table. The dam broke. Anna's shoulders began to shake, and then the sobs came. Deep, wrenching sounds that seemed to tear themselves from somewhere she'd kept locked away for years. All the grief she'd carried, all the loss and fear and bitter ideology that had sustained her through the war's worst moments poured out in the middle of an American Thanksgiving dinner while enemy soldiers patted her shoulders and offered her tissues and told her it was okay, that she was safe now. "I don't understand," she gasped between sobs, looking around the table at faces full of concern rather than contempt. "We were enemies. You're supposed to hate us. We're supposed to hate you. How can you invite us to your table? How can you treat us like family when we tried to kill you?" Captain Mitchell leaned forward, his voice gentle but clear. "Because the war is over, Anna, and because hating people takes more energy than we have left. We're all tired of fighting, tired of losing people we love, tired of being afraid. Maybe it's time we tried something different." Greta reached for Anna's hand and found it shaking. Across the table, Liesel wept quietly into her napkin while Sergeant Thompson awkwardly patted her shoulder and promised that everything would be all right. Around them, the celebration continued, but softer now, more subdued, as if the entire room recognized that something sacred was happening at their table. Something that had nothing to do with national allegiances and everything to do with the simple human decision to choose mercy over revenge, inclusion over isolation, hope over the comfortable familiarity of hatred. The days after Thanksgiving passed in a strange, quiet aftermath, like the stillness that follows a storm. Anna moved through her kitchen duties with mechanical precision, but something fundamental had shifted in her posture, her expression, the way she held conversations. The rigid military bearing remained, but underneath it lay something softer and more uncertain, a person trying to rebuild herself from pieces that no longer fit together the same way. "I keep waiting for the guilt to go away," she confided to Greta one evening as they folded laundry in the communal room. Her hands worked automatically, creasing sheets with hospital corners that would have impressed any drill sergeant. "I wake up every morning expecting to feel ashamed for crying at their table, for accepting their kindness. But instead I just feel empty, like someone removed something heavy I'd been carrying so long I thought it was part of me." Greta understood. She'd spent years learning to see Americans as faceless enemies, worthy only of destruction or conversion. Now she knew their names, their stories, their homesickness for places called Iowa and Texas and Massachusetts. Pete had shown her photographs of his younger sister who looked remarkably like Liesel. Frank talked about his mother's letters and worried about his father's arthritis. They were heartbreakingly, inconveniently human. "Maybe guilt was just another kind of armor," she suggested, smoothing wrinkles from a pillowcase. "Something to protect us from having to think too hard about what we were really fighting for." Captain Mitchell found her there an hour later carrying a red envelope that made her heart leap before she even saw the Red Cross insignia. His expression was carefully neutral. The face of someone delivering news that could change everything. "From the International Red Cross," he said simply, placing it in her hands. "About your sister." Greta's fingers trembled as she opened it, Anna and Liesel gathering close to read over her shoulder. The letter was brief, clinical in its precision, but the words might as well have been written in fire. "Ingrid Hoffman, age 16, currently residing with maternal aunt in Cologne. Address follows. Designated as displaced person but in good health, inquiring about whereabouts of sister Greta." She was alive. After months of not knowing, of imagining the worst, of carrying the weight of uncertainty like stones in her chest, Ingrid was alive and looking for her. Greta sank into the nearest chair and held the letter against her heart. Feeling something crack open inside her that had nothing to do with breaking and everything to do with hope finally having room to breathe. "Good news travels fast around here," Captain Mitchell said with a small smile. "Mary's already put in a request for writing materials and international postage. No charge to you, of course." The kindness still caught her off guard, even after weeks of experiencing it daily. "Why?" she asked, looking up at him. "Why do you keep being so generous when you don't have to be?" He considered the question seriously, as he seemed to consider everything. "Because mercy isn't something you ration, Greta. The more you use, the more you have. And because every letter that reunites a family makes the world a little bit more whole again." December arrived with unexpected warmth, as if Texas were trying to convince them that winter didn't have to mean suffering. The camp took on a different rhythm as rumors of Christmas preparations began circulating among both American soldiers and German prisoners. There was talk of a celebration even larger than Thanksgiving, with musicians coming from Austin and packages arriving from families back home. But it was the arrival of new prisoners that truly tested everything they'd learned about mercy and second chances. 23 German POWs arrived on a cold Tuesday morning, transported from camps in Louisiana where conditions had been far harsher than anything at Camp Swift. They stumbled off the trucks hollow-eyed and suspicious, flinching when American guards spoke to them, expecting violence that had become their normal experience. "They look like we did," Liesel observed quietly, watching the new arrivals through the kitchen window. Like they're waiting for the trap to spring. Anna set down her paring knife and studied the men with eyes that held new understanding. Someone needs to tell them it's not a trap. Someone needs to explain that these Americans are different. It was Greta who volunteered to help with orientation, working alongside Sergeant Washington to welcome the newcomers and explain Camp Swift's routines. She found herself using the same gentle voice Captain Mitchell had used with them, the same patient repetition Mary had shown when teaching them kitchen procedures. When the new prisoners looked at her with suspicion, a German woman working freely alongside American soldiers, she simply smiled and told them to wait, to watch, to give it time. "You're collaborating," accused one man, a sergeant with dead eyes and scars on his hands. "Working with the enemy, betraying everything we fought for." "I'm learning that enemies can choose to stop being enemies," Greta replied calmly, "and I'm discovering what it feels like to be treated like a human being instead of a symbol or a problem to be solved." The Christmas preparations became a bridge between the established prisoners and the newcomers. Captain Mitchell announced that anyone who wanted to help with decorations or cooking would be welcome, regardless of how long they'd been at the camp. Slowly, cautiously, some of the new arrivals began to join the preparations, drawn perhaps by curiosity or hunger or simple loneliness. Liesel organized an impromptu art project, teaching anyone interested how to make paper decorations from scrap materials. Her quiet patience drew in several of the most suspicious newcomers, men who found themselves cutting paper snowflakes and struggling with English words for beautiful and peaceful. Anna, surprising everyone, including herself, began teaching basic English phrases to prisoners who expressed interest in learning, her precise military mind perfect for breaking down language into manageable lessons. On Christmas Eve, as snow began falling outside, the first white Christmas any of them had seen in years, Greta stood at the window of their barracks and watched American soldiers and German prisoners working together to hang lights around the camp's central courtyard. The scene would have been impossible to imagine 6 months ago, when hatred and fear governed every interaction between their peoples. "I got a letter from Ingrid yesterday," she told Anna and Liesel, pulling out pages covered with her sister's familiar handwriting. "She says she's been accepted to study art in Munich when the schools reopen properly. She wants to paint pictures that help people remember what beauty looks like after everything ugly they've seen." "What did you tell her about this place?" Anna asked. Greta smiled, remembering her careful words, trying to explain the inexplicable. "I told her that sometimes enemies decide to become neighbors instead, and sometimes neighbors decide to become something like family even when everything they were taught says it's impossible." Outside, someone had started singing Christmas carols, German and English voices blending in harmonies that spoke a language older and deeper than national boundaries. For the first time since the war began, Greta allowed herself to believe that the future might hold something other than revenge and rebuilding from rubble. It might hold the radical possibility of people choosing to see each other as human first and everything else second.